A pregnant woman, homeless, penniless, abandoned by the entire town. And the only one who doesn't close the door on her is the cold, fearsome man everyone dreads. She doesn't ask for money. She doesn't ask for pity. She only asks for work. But behind that desolate peach orchard lies a painful secret that neither of them is ready to face. Like and comment the name of the city you're watching to let me know how far this story has progressed, and follow to the end, because this is a story that will stay with you for a long time. The rain had been falling since noon, the kind that came in sideways and didn't apologize for it, and Elena Ashcroft had stopped counting how many doors she'd knocked on. 7. Maybe 8. She'd lost track somewhere around the feed store when the owner's wife had looked at her stomach before looking at her face, and whatever she'd been about to say had died before it reached her lips. The door had closed with a quiet click that somehow felt louder than a slam. Elena stood at the edge of the Harlow Valley Road now, one hand pressed flat against her lower back, where the ache had settled in like a tenant who'd decided not to pay rent. Her travel bag hung off her left shoulder, heavy enough that the strap had worn a raw line through her coat. Inside it, 2 changes of clothes, a wool blanket she'd bought at a church sale in the last town, a tin of dried apricots she'd been rationing for 3 days, and a small notebook where she'd been writing down recipes since she was 14 years old, the one thing nobody had managed to take from her yet. She was 31 years old, 8 months pregnant, and she had $4.60 to her name. The town of Mill Haven, population just under 900, had made its position on her situation very clear. The boarding house on Clement Street had a sign in the window, "Rooms available," but the woman who answered the door had taken one look at Elena's condition and said the rooms were actually spoken for. The livery stable owner had been kinder about it, almost apologetic, but his wife had appeared behind him, and the conversation had ended there. The mercantile had let her stand inside out of the rain long enough to ask if anyone in town needed a cook or a housekeeper, and the man behind the counter had told her she might try the Valley Farms, though his tone suggested he didn't think much of her chances. She had tried the Valley Farms. 2 of them had dogs that answered the door before the owners did. One had a foreman who told her through the window that they weren't hiring. And the last one, a tidy little operation with painted fences and a vegetable garden that still had its autumn kale standing, had a woman who'd stepped onto the porch and said, not unkindly, but not kindly either, "Honey, you need to keep moving. This isn't a place for someone in your situation." Elena had wanted to ask what situation exactly she was supposed to be in instead, but her back hurt and her feet were wet and she was tired in a way that went past her bones, so she'd kept moving. The road bent west past a stand of bare cottonwoods, and that was where she first saw it. Not the ranch house, which was set back from the road and half hidden by a line of old fence posts, but the orchard. It stretched along the hillside like something out of a memory, rows of peach trees with their branches still heavy despite the lateness of the season, and beneath them, visible even from the road, a carpet of fallen fruit. Hundreds of peaches. Thousands, maybe. Lying in the mud and the wet grass, split open, rotting, the smell of them sweet and fermented and faintly heartbreaking, all that food going back into the ground untouched. Elena stopped walking. She stood there in the rain and looked at those peaches for a long moment, and something shifted in her chest that wasn't quite hope and wasn't quite grief, but was somewhere between them. She knew what could be done with fruit like that. She'd been working in kitchens since she was 16, and she knew the math of a harvest. How many jars, how many bushels, how long it would take, what it would sell for if someone bothered to put the work in. Someone wasn't bothering. The ranch house was a 2-story structure that had probably been impressive once in the way that solid, well-built things were impressive before time and neglect got into them. The porch boards looked soft in places. One of the upper shutters hung at an angle. The barn beyond it was in better shape than the house, which told her something about whoever lived here. They cared more about the animals than themselves, or maybe just had clear ideas about what needed maintaining. There was a light on inside, faint behind curtained windows. Elena picked up her bag and walked toward it. She knocked twice, and for a long moment nothing happened, and she was already thinking about where she'd sleep tonight. There was a shallow overhang on the back of the mercantile that might keep the worst of the rain off, when the door opened. The man who opened it was somewhere in his early 40s, though he had the look of someone who'd been through enough to make age a complicated calculation. Tall, broad through the shoulders, with dark hair going gray at the temples, and a jaw that hadn't seen a razor in at least 4 days. His eyes were a particular shade of brown that Elena would have called watchful if she was being generous, and suspicious if she wasn't. He was wearing a work shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbows despite the cold, and he held the door at an angle that blocked most of the interior from view, which struck her as a habit rather than a deliberate choice. The posture of a man who'd gotten used to not letting people in. He looked at her the same way the others had. The stomach first, then the face. But he didn't start talking right away, and that was different. "I'm not looking for charity," Elena said before he could. He said nothing. "I saw your orchard." She kept her voice even, businesslike, the way she'd learned to talk in commercial kitchens where nobody had patience for anything that sounded like begging. "You've got a significant amount of fruit on the ground. Peaches, from the look of it, and they're not all gone yet. The ones that fell in the last day or two are probably still workable if someone gets to them. I'm a cook. I've done preservation work. I can put up your harvest in jars, make preserves, dry what won't hold, turn what's too far gone into vinegar stock. I can do it properly, not like someone who read about it once." He still hadn't said anything, just watched her. "I'm not asking for money," she said. "I'm asking for somewhere dry to sleep until my baby comes. I know that sounds like a bad trade for you, but the fruit's going to waste either way, and I need somewhere to be, and I thought—" She stopped, pressed her lips together. "I thought maybe we could help each other." The rain tapped steadily on the porch roof. Somewhere in the barn, a horse shifted and stamped. "How far along are you?" the man said. His voice was rougher than she'd expected, like it didn't get used enough to stay smooth. 8 months. That's not much time." "No," she agreed. "It isn't." He looked at her for another long moment, and she could see him working through some interior calculation she wasn't privy to, some ledger of risk and inconvenience that she had no way to influence. She made herself stand still, made herself breathe. The ache in her back pulsed steadily. "There's a shed at the east end of the barn," he said finally. "Been using it for storage, but it's mostly empty now. Has a wood stove. I can't promise it's clean." "I can clean," Elena said. He stepped back from the door and turned away, without another word, which she took as the closest thing to an invitation she was going to get. She followed him through the house. She registered the dim interior, furniture that was solid and once good, a kitchen she could already see the bones of, the kind of space that had been designed for real cooking and had gone mostly unused, and out through a side door toward the barn. The shed was smaller than she'd hoped and larger than nothing, which was the only calculation that mattered. About 12 feet by 10, with plank walls and a metal roof and a wood stove that looked functional. A cast iron thing that had probably been burning wood since before either of them was born. There were a few old crates stacked along one wall, a broken saddle rack, a pile of canvas tarps. The floor was swept earth, hard-packed and level. The single window was intact. "Stove works," the man said. "Wood's in the lean-to by the barn. You'll need to bring your own in." "I can do that." He was already turning to leave. "I'm Elena," she said. He paused. "Gideon Hale." "Thank you," she said. "I mean that." He didn't answer, just walked back toward the house, and she stood in the doorway of the shed watching him go and trying to figure out what kind of man she'd just made a deal with. She found out over the next few days, in pieces. Gideon Hale had owned this land for 11 years, had run it as a working cattle and fruit operation, and had, according to the hired hand named Clyde, who drove the supply wagon and had a gift for talking that bordered on a medical condition, experienced a sequence of losses in the past 3 years that would have broken most men outright. "Lost his wife in the spring of '91, Clyde said. He was a wiry man in his 50s with a sun-weathered face and the kind of mustache that had probably been fashionable sometime and just hadn't gotten the news that it wasn't anymore. He was helping Elena carry bushels of salvaged peaches into the kitchen on her second morning, mostly because she'd asked, and he found it difficult to say no to someone who looked like she might topple over with each load. Fever just took her fast. Then the boy, he paused, adjusted his grip on the bushel basket. Lost the boy the following year, kicked by a horse. He was 9. Elena set her basket down on the kitchen floor and straightened up carefully, one hand going to her back. "I didn't know that." "Nobody tells you things about Gideon Hale," Clyde said. "He doesn't encourage it. Man shut down after that, kept the cattle going for another season, then sold most of the herd. The orchard just... He looked out the kitchen window toward the trees. He just stopped bothering with it. Couldn't really say if he even sees it anymore. That explained the fruit on the ground. It didn't explain why he'd let her stay, but she was trying not to examine that too closely. Some gifts came with conditions that only revealed themselves later, and some came from a place and a person they couldn't articulate themselves. Either way, she was here. Either way, she had a stove and a roof and work she understood how to do. She started before sunrise on the third morning. The kitchen was large by any standard. It had been built for a household, for cooking that fed multiple people through long seasons. There was a good range, a heavy iron thing that heated evenly once you understood its temperament. There were shelves, mostly bare, canning jars, maybe 24, dusty on a high shelf, a cold cellar beneath a trap door in the floor, which she found was not quite as cold as it should have been, but would serve. A hand pump at the sink that still worked. She started with the fruit closest to the house, the stuff that had been on the ground the longest and needed deciding on fastest, the peaches that had split and softened past. Saving, she cleared to the compost pile. The ones that had come down in the last rain, still firm at the center, she sorted by size on the kitchen table and began working through. Preserving was not a simple task. It was also not a mysterious one. It was labor, sustained, attentive, unglamorous labor that required you to be present and careful for hours at a stretch, without much to show for it until the jars started lining up on the counter and you could see the work accumulating. Elena had learned it from her grandmother, who'd learned it from hers, and what she knew about it went past recipes into something closer to instinct. The way you could read a fruit by feel, tell by the smell of a jar whether the seal had taken, know from the color of a syrup when it was ready. She worked until her back told her to stop, then rested, then worked again. By the end of the first week, she'd put up 31 jars of whole peach preserves, 14 of spiced peach butter, and had a batch of peach vinegar working in a covered crock by the stove. She'd also, without quite planning to, started cooking for Gideon. It had begun practically. She was in the kitchen anyway, working through the morning, and it seemed wasteful not to put something on for midday when the stove was already hot. The first time she left a plate covered on the table and went back to her shed without comment. The second time, she was still at the range when he came in, and there was a moment of mutual surprise that she resolved by serving him a bowl of potato soup without asking if he wanted it. He sat down and ate it. He didn't say it was good, but he didn't say it wasn't, and he cleaned the bowl, and the next morning he left a bucket of fresh milk outside the shed door without any explanation. She used the milk to make a custard with some of the peach butter and some flour she'd found in a canister at the back of the pantry. Still good. Left half of it on the table with a note that said stove temperature is uneven on the left side. I adjusted the damper. The note was, she recognized, a way of talking to him that didn't require either of them to be in the same room. He left a note of his own 2 days later. It was under a small bag of sugar left outside the kitchen door. The note said, "More jars in the cellar, second shelf, need cleaning." She found 46 jars, cleaned them, and put them to work. The hired hands, there were 3 of them, though one, a young man named Thomas, worked only part-time, had watched her arrival with the particular mixture of curiosity and wariness that she'd come to expect from men who weren't sure what category to put her in. She wasn't family, she wasn't exactly an employee. She was a pregnant woman doing work in a kitchen and an orchard, and that didn't fit neatly into anything they knew how to relate to. Clyde, who talked constantly, was the easiest. He decided she was all right within the first hour of knowing her, a judgment based primarily on the fact that she'd laughed at one of his jokes about a mule and a tax collector, and he remained consistently helpful in the uncomplicated way of someone who doesn't have the energy for sustained suspicion. The other full-time hand, a man named Reed, was different. He was younger than Clyde by maybe 15 years, quieter, with a focused, deliberate way of moving that suggested someone who thought before he acted. He watched her for the first week without speaking to her directly, and she could feel the assessment in it. Not hostile, just careful, the way someone is careful about a change in their environment until they understand what it means. On the 8th day, he came into the kitchen in the early afternoon and stood in the doorway without saying anything until she looked up from the jars she was sealing. "You got any more of that soup?" he said. The one from Tuesday. I've got the base of it, she said. I can have a pot ready by supper. He nodded once, already turning to leave. Read, she said. He stopped. The second row of trees from the north fence, the ones with the split bark on the lower trunks. You know what's wrong with them? He turned back around. His expression shifted slightly, some door opening by a fraction. Borer beetles. Had them 2 seasons ago. We treated some of them, but not all. Can they be saved? Some of them. If someone goes back and does the treatment properly. He paused. Haven't been anyone to bother. I'd like to bother, Elena said. If you can show me what needs doing. He looked at her for a moment, at her stomach, at her hands, which were stained with fruit and roughened from the jar work. I can show you, he said. Not today. Not today, she agreed. He left, and she went back to sealing jars, and she thought that was probably the most useful conversation she'd had since arriving in Millhaven. The gossip reached her through Clyde, which was the most reliable route for anything traveling through the valley. People are talking, he said one morning, leaning against the kitchen door frame with a coffee cup she'd given him, which he seemed to have adopted as a personal possession. In town. Elena was rendering peach syrup on the range, watching the temperature with the focused attention it required. About? About you being here. He wrapped both hands around the cup. About Gideon having a woman in the sheds. I'm in the shed, she said. Singular. One shed. Well, that's not how it's traveling. She stirred the syrup. What are they saying? Clyde shifted his weight. He had the look of someone who'd rather not be delivering news but had come too far to back out now. Most of it's just noise, but some of it's coming from Harlan Burke's direction, and his noise has a way of landing harder than other people's. Harlan Burke. She'd heard that name twice already, once from Clyde and once from Thomas, the young part-time hand who'd mentioned it in the context of explaining why certain things at the Hale Ranch had gotten harder in the past year. Burke owned the largest spread in the valley, the kind of operation that had enough money behind it to absorb bad seasons and enough influence to shape how the other ranchers thought about their neighbors. He'd made offers on Gideon's land twice, according to Thomas. Both times, Gideon had refused. The offers had stopped, but something else had started. A kind of low-grade pressure, the way you could close a vice without ever touching the thing inside it. What specifically is Burke saying? Elena asked. That Gideon's got a loose woman living on his property, that it reflects poorly on the community, that decent families shouldn't be doing business with a man who conducts himself that way. Clyde looked uncomfortable delivering it. He said some things about the baby. She kept stirring. The syrup was almost where she needed it. What kind of things? The unkind variety. I see. She lifted the pot off the heat, set it on the tile rest, and stood for a moment looking at the amber liquid with the low afternoon light catching it. Her back ached, her feet ached. She was 8 months pregnant and had been on them since before dawn. Does Gideon know Burke is saying this? I expect so, Clyde said. Not much travels in this valley that Gideon doesn't eventually hear. Has it affected anything? Business, buyers, anything like that? Clyde hesitated, which was its own kind of answer. What? She said. Henderson's feed pulled their standing order, said they were going with another supplier for the season. He looked at his coffee. Could be coincidence. It wasn't coincidence, and they both knew it. She picked up the pot again and began ladling the syrup into jars, careful, deliberate, not spilling. I'll talk to Gideon, she said. He won't want to discuss it. No, she said. I expect he won't. She found him in the barn that evening, working on a length of fence rail that needed replacing. He was doing it by lantern light, which told her either he'd lost track of time or he'd been avoiding coming inside, and she suspected it was the second. I heard about Henderson's, she said from the doorway. He didn't stop working. It's not your concern. It is if my being here is the cause. Henderson's been looking for a reason to shift suppliers for 2 seasons, Gideon said. Burke just handed him one. That's a generous way to look at it. It's the accurate way. He set down the plane he'd been using and turned to look at her, and she could see the tiredness in him. Not the honest tiredness of work, which had a satisfaction underneath it, but the other kind, the kind that came from carrying something heavy for a long time. Burke wants this land, has wanted it for years. He'll use whatever's available. Then I'm making it easier for him. He doesn't need easier, Gideon said. He's patient. He'll find another angle. Elena stood in the doorway with the night cold coming in at her back. A horse shifted in a nearby stall, the sound of it familiar and steady. I need to tell you something, she said. He waited. There's nothing wrong with what I'm doing here, she said. I know what people are saying. I know how it looks. And I'm not going to apologize for it because I have nothing to apologize for. And I think you know that. She paused. But if you want me to leave, I will. I'd rather you say it directly than wait for it to become a problem you don't know how to fix. He looked at her for a long moment. The lantern threw uneven light across his face, catching the angles of it, the set of his jaw. I don't want you to leave, he said. It came out flat, like a fact being stated, which she thought was probably the only way he knew how to say things. All right, she said. The preserves. He picked up the plane again. Alderman's Grocery in Millhaven sent word today. They want to carry them on consignment. Wanted to know if there'd be more. She felt something move in her chest, cautious, aware of itself. There'll be more, she said. I've got 3 more bushels ready to work through, and if we pull the late fruit from the eastern rows before the next frost, there's another batch after that. Good, he said. She turned to go. Elena. She stopped. The shed gets cold at night. He was looking at the fence rail, not at her. There's a spare room on the ground floor of the house. It's got a proper bed. You should take it. She stood still for a moment, parsing this. It was not, she understood, an overture of any kind. It was a man who'd decided that having a pregnant woman sleep in a shed in October was not something he was comfortable with, and who was doing something about it in the most practical way he could manage. Thank you, she said. He nodded, once, and went back to his fence rail. And she walked back toward the shed to gather her things, the lantern light from the barn falling in a long yellow rectangle across the dark yard behind her. The week settled into a rhythm that she hadn't expected. Not comfortable exactly, but functional in a way that had its own quiet satisfaction. She rose early and worked until midday, then rested through the worst of the afternoon heat, then worked again until supper. Gideon and the hands ate at the kitchen table now as a matter of course, something that had happened so gradually she couldn't have identified when it started. The meals were not elaborate. They were what the pantry allowed, supplemented by the small kitchen garden she'd found behind the house, still yielding the last of its root vegetables before winter closed in. But they were proper meals, hot and nourishing and plentiful, and she could see the difference in the men who ate them. Clyde talked through every supper. Thomas, the young one, was quiet but attentive, and had developed a habit of staying after to help clear the table without being asked, which she thought said something good about whoever had raised him. Reed ate with focused efficiency and rarely spoke, but he had begun acknowledging her in the morning with a nod that contained, she thought, a kind of respect. Gideon sat at the head of the table and mostly listened. He asked questions sometimes, about the preservation work, about the orchard, once about a recipe she'd made with dried corn and smoked pork that he ate 2 portions of without comment. He did not ask about her past, where she'd come from, who the father of her child was, or why she'd been walking the valley road with everything she owned in a single bag. She was grateful for that. Some things weren't his to know yet, and he seemed to understand it without being told. One afternoon in late October, she was in the orchard working on the borer beetle treatment Reed had shown her, a painstaking process involving a stiff brush and a mixture of lime and soap applied to the damaged bark, when she heard footsteps behind her and turned to find Gideon standing a few rows back, watching. You don't have to do that, he said. I know. She kept working. The trees are worth saving. 3 of them probably won't make it regardless, but the others should be all right if this is done properly. He was quiet for a moment. Then he came closer, crouching down to look at what she was doing with the bark on the lower trunk. You learned this somewhere? Ran a kitchen on a fruit farm in the Willamette Valley for 2 years, she said. Before that, worked in a hotel kitchen in Portland. Before that, she paused, focused on a patch of damage that was worse than she'd expected. A lot of different places. I've always cooked. Took me a while to understand that I could turn that into something real. What happened in Portland? She glanced at him. He was still looking at the tree, not at her. A lot of things happened, she said. None of them are relevant to peach orchards. He accepted that. She went back to the treatment, working her way around the trunk with the methodical care it required, and after a moment, he picked up the second brush she'd brought without being asked and started on the tree next to hers. They worked in silence for an hour. The sky was the pale, washed-out blue of late October, and the light was already starting to angle toward afternoon when they moved to the last two trees in the affected row. She was tired in a bone-deep way that she was getting used to, her lower back announcing itself with each movement, and she knew she should stop soon. "The fruit on the ground when I arrived," she said. How long had it been falling like that? Gideon was quiet for long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. 3 seasons, he said finally. Maybe 4. I stopped keeping track. She understood that he wasn't talking only about the fruit. She didn't say anything else about it. Neither did he. They finished the last tree as the light was failing, and she gathered her tools and he walked back toward the barn, and the orchard was quiet behind them. The treated trees standing in their rows with the brush marks on their trunks, like small, careful acts of attention that no one would see from a distance. By mid-November, the kitchen shelves that had been empty held 112 jars of preserves, vinegars, pickles, and dried fruit. The cold cellar had potatoes, turnips, and 3 varieties of winter squash she'd bartered for with some of the early preserve batches at the Millhaven market. The ranch house was warmer than it had been in years, partly because she'd found and resealed a gap in the kitchen wall where the cold was coming in, and partly because a house that has someone genuinely living in it holds heat differently than one that's merely occupied. Alderman's Grocery had taken 24 jars on the first consignment and sold them within a week. They'd sent word asking for more. A woman named Mrs. Cathcart, who ran the hotel restaurant in Millhaven, had tasted the peach butter and asked if Elena could supply her through the winter. Clyde, who seemed to have appointed himself as an informal business agent, had handled the negotiation with visible delight and reported back that Mrs. Cathcart had called it the best preserved peach she'd tasted in 20 years of running a kitchen. She also said, Clyde added, dropping his voice slightly, that whatever Harlan Burke might say about this place, he's a fool and a bully, and she's been saying so privately for years. Don't repeat that, Elena said. Already told Reed and Thomas, he said, without apparent regret. She'd watched the money come in, modest amounts, but real, and watched something shift in how Gideon moved through the ranch. Not dramatically. Nothing about him was dramatic. But the particular stillness he carried, the one that wasn't peace but its opposite, had begun to change its quality. He still didn't talk much. He still moved through the house like a man being careful not to disturb something. But he'd started repairing things. The porch boards, the crooked shutter, a section of fence along the north pasture that had been leaning since before she arrived. Small acts of maintenance that said, without saying it, that he thought the place might be worth the effort. She noticed. She didn't remark on it. On the 3rd Thursday of November, a cold morning with frost on the grass that hadn't quite melted by 10, she was at the kitchen table going through accounts. She'd started keeping track of the preserve sales in the notebook that had previously held only recipes, which felt appropriate, when she heard hooves in the yard. She didn't think much of it until she heard Gideon's voice, and then another voice she didn't recognize, and something in the tone of the second voice made her go still. She didn't go to the window. She waited. Gideon came in 10 minutes later. He poured himself a cup of coffee from the pot on the stove and stood at the range drinking it, which was unusual. He typically took his coffee at the table or took it with him when he left. That was Burke, she said. He didn't confirm or deny it, just drank his coffee. What did he want? What he always wants. Gideon set the cup down. He's offering to buy the eastern acreage, the orchard section. She kept her face very still. What did you say? I said no. He'll come back. I know he will. Gideon looked at the window, the frost-bright morning beyond it. He mentioned you. She waited. Said I was making poor decisions for a man in my position. Said the ranch was struggling and it wasn't wise to be... He paused. He was less polite about it than that. I imagine he was. Gideon picked up his cup again. I told him my ranch, my decisions. He wasn't pleased. No, she said. He wouldn't be. She looked back down at her accounts. The numbers were real, and they were good, and she had not imagined them. She'd been doing this work for 6 weeks, and the work was visible. That was not nothing. "Gideon," she said. He looked at her. "Thank you," she said, "for that." He made a sound that wasn't quite acknowledgement and wasn't quite dismissal, finished his coffee, and went back outside, and Elena returned to her numbers in the bright, cold morning with the jars lined up on the shelves behind her, catching the light like a small and quiet form of evidence. Burke didn't come back the following week, or the week after that, which was the kind of silence that didn't feel like peace. Elena had been around enough difficult men to know the difference between someone who'd given up and someone who was simply repositioning, and Harlan Burke, from everything she'd gathered, was not the type to absorb a refusal and move on. He was the type to wait until the angle improved. She kept working. December arrived the way it always did in the valley. Not all at once, but in increments, the mornings getting harder, the light lasting a little less each day, the ground going from soft to firm to frozen along the fence lines. The orchard had gone bare by the first week of the month, the last of the season's fruit long since processed and either jarred or dried or turned into the vinegar stock that sat in 4 large crocks in the cold cellar, working quietly in the dark. There was nothing left to save from the trees. The saving was done, and what remained was the evidence of it. 147 jars on the kitchen shelves, another 60 in the cellar alongside the root vegetables, and a ledger in Elena's notebook that showed, in her small, careful handwriting, what the ranch had taken in from preserve sales since mid-October. It was not a fortune. But it was more than the ranch had seen from the orchard in 3 years, and she knew it, and she thought Gideon knew it, though he didn't say so directly. What he did instead was start talking to her about the spring, not about whether she'd be there for it. He never framed it that way. He talked about it the way you talk about weather, as a thing that was coming regardless of what anyone planned, that would need to be dealt with when it arrived. He mentioned the eastern trees, the ones she'd treated for the beetle damage, and said he thought 3 of them were probably lost, but the others might surprise them come blossom season. He mentioned that Reed had found evidence of a drainage problem in the second row from the south fence, where the soil pooled after heavy rain, and that fixing it properly would mean some digging in late winter. "I could look at the drainage maps," Elena said one evening. They were at the kitchen table after supper, Clyde and the others having drifted back toward the bunkhouse, the lamp between them throwing a warm circle of light that didn't reach the walls. "If you have them, I helped plan an irrigation repair on the Willamette property. The principle's the same." Gideon looked at her across the table. He had the particular expression he got sometimes, not quite surprise, more like recalibration, the face of a man updating an assumption. "I have maps," he said. "They're in the desk in the front room. I'll look at them tomorrow." He nodded, and that was that. And she thought nothing of it until she woke at 3 in the morning with her back hurting in a new way and lay still for a long time in the dark room listening to the ranch settle around her, thinking about drainage patterns and trying not to think about how much she'd started to know this place. She knew the sound the range made when it was cold and needed coaxing. She knew which floorboard in the hallway announced itself if you didn't step to the left. She knew that the barn cats, there were 3 of them, 2 gray and 1 orange, came to the kitchen door at the same time every morning, and that Clyde had been feeding them scraps, despite having told her twice that he thought barn cats should work for their keep. She knew that Reed checked the fence line every morning before breakfast, and that he'd begun timing it so he came through the yard around when the coffee was ready. She knew that Thomas, the young one, was saving money to send east for a saddle catalog he'd been talking about for weeks, and that he was too proud to ask Gideon for an advance on his wages, but had left the catalog page accidentally on purpose on the kitchen table twice now, where she'd be sure to see it. She knew which window Gideon stood at when he was thinking about something he didn't want to talk about. She knew too much about this place for someone who'd been planning to leave it. That was the thought she turned over in the dark at 3 in the morning, with the baby shifting inside her in that rolling, insistent way that had started happening more frequently in the past 2 weeks. She'd packed her bag when she arrived, and she hadn't unpacked it. It sat at the foot of the bed, still organized the way she'd organized it on the road. The wool blanket on top for easy access, the notebook in the outer pocket, the spare clothes folded flat. She'd added things to it since arriving, small items that fit in the gaps, but the fundamental arrangement was the same. The arrangement of someone who expected to need to leave quickly. She understood why she'd kept it that way. Understanding it didn't make it easier to change. She pressed her palm flat against her stomach and waited for the baby to settle, and eventually it did, and she slept. The drainage maps, when she found them the next morning, were better than she'd expected. Someone had done careful work on them, probably 15 or 20 years ago, and the paper was still readable, if fragile. She spread them on the kitchen table and spent an hour with them before Gideon came in for his morning coffee, tracing the water flow patterns with one finger and making notes in the margin of her notebook. "Here," she said when he sat down, turning the map so he could see it from his side of the table. "The problem Reed found is downstream of this ridge section. See how the grade runs? In a wet winter, the water has nowhere to go but pool at the low point. You'd need to cut a channel here." She indicated a line with her pencil, running toward the existing drainage ditch, maybe 40 feet of digging. Reed would know better than me, but that's what the map suggests. Gideon studied the map with the focused attention he gave to anything that required a practical decision. He was not, she'd learned, someone who made decisions quickly, but when he made them, they tended to hold. He didn't change his mind often, not because he was rigid, but because he thought things through before committing. "The ground's frozen," he said. "It'll thaw by February. If Reed starts watching it when the first thaw comes, he can get the channel cut before the spring rains hit." He looked at the map for a moment longer. "You've been thinking about the spring." It was not quite a question. She met his eyes across the table. "I've been thinking about the trees," she said. "They need someone paying attention to them." He held her gaze for a beat, 2 beats. Then he looked back at the map. "I'll talk to Reed," he said. She poured him his coffee and went back to the stove. The thing between them, she had no better word for it than that. No cleaner description of what was happening in the incremental daily accumulation of shared space and shared work, was not romantic in any uncomplicated way. It was something more tentative and more honest than that. Two people who had both learned to keep their own counsel, finding that there were things that were easier to bear when there was someone else in the room. Not fixing anything, not filling any particular gap, just present in a way that turned out to matter. He'd stopped eating alone. That was the most visible change. Before Elena arrived, apparently he'd taken his meals standing at the range or sitting at the desk in the front room with a plate balanced on the papers, which was the eating behavior of someone who had stopped thinking of food as a social act. Now he sat at the table with the rest of them every evening, and while he didn't match Clyde's conversational output, nobody could. He listened, and occasionally he said something that was drier and more precise than anyone expected. And once, when Thomas had been telling a story about a horse that had developed an inexplicable fear of a particular fence post and kept rerouting himself by a quarter mile to avoid it, Gideon had said something about the horse's judgment that made even Reed laugh. Elena had looked across the table at him in that moment, and he'd caught her looking, and there had been something in his face, just briefly, just the shadow of it, that she thought might have been something close to ease. It was gone before she could be sure of it. She didn't mention it. She refilled the coffee pot, and Thomas kept telling his story, and the lamp burned steadily on the table. The trouble with Harlan Burke arrived properly on a Wednesday afternoon in the second week of December, though it came in a form she hadn't anticipated. She'd gone into Millhaven with Clyde, who was making the supply run, because Mrs. Cathcart at the hotel restaurant had asked for another 24 jars, and Elena wanted to discuss what the woman might want through the deep winter months. Whether there was an appetite for dried apple or pear products, if she could source the fruit, what quantities would be useful to plan for. It was a practical errand that had taken on, she realized, the shape of something else. She was making plans that assumed she would be here to fulfill them. She was standing in the hotel lobby waiting for Mrs. Cathcart to come out from the kitchen when she heard her name. Not spoken to her, spoken across the lobby in a voice that assumed she wasn't close enough to hear or didn't care if she was. "Ashcroft woman, yes, the one staying out at Hale's place. You've seen her in town." She didn't turn around. She kept her eyes on the door to the kitchen and her face still. "Can't say I have." A second voice, woman's, lower. "Well, you'd know her if you did. Obviously with child, no husband in evidence. Nobody knows where she came from, only that she showed up at Hale's door in the rain and he let her stay, which tells you something about his judgment these days." "It's a charitable thing to do," the second woman said, with the careful neutrality of someone who wasn't sure which way the conversation was heading. Charitable. The first voice gave the word a particular quality, the kind that hollows a word out until it means its opposite. That's one word for it. Harlan Burke says she came from Portland, and anyone who knows what Portland has in it knows what kind of women come out of that city looking for somewhere to land. Elena's hands at her sides were very still. I heard she's been selling preserves, the second woman said. Oh, she's quite the entrepreneur, setting herself up very nicely, from what I understand. Getting cozy in a widower's house, making herself indispensable, putting her products in the local stores. It's a very organized approach, if you think about it. Poor Gideon Hale hasn't had a woman's company in 2 years, so I suppose she knew what she was doing when she picked his door, Mrs. Cathcart came out of the kitchen at that moment, wiping her hands on her apron, and said, Miss Ashcroft, sorry to keep you waiting, loud enough that it cut through the lobby, and Elena turned and walked to meet her without looking at the two women behind her. She got through the meeting. She discussed the winter supply plan. She agreed to 24 jars of mixed preserves and an additional batch of dried pear if she could source the fruit from the alderman's store at a fair price. She wrote it down in her notebook and shook Mrs. Cathcart's hand and walked out through the hotel lobby, past the two women who were now talking about something entirely different, as if the previous conversation had never happened. She sat in the wagon and waited for Clyde to finish at the feed store. The cold was sharp and clean, and she breathed it deliberately, in and out. Her back ached. The baby, who had opinions about sitting in cold wagons, shifted in what felt like complaint. She put her hand on her stomach and thought about the woman's voice saying poor Gideon Hale with that particular inflection, that suggestion of a man being taken advantage of by a calculated stranger. She thought about whether it was true. Not the malicious version of it, not the Portland implication, none of the cruelty that had been built around it, but the kernel underneath. Had she picked Gideon Hale's door? Had she looked at that rotting orchard and seen not just fruit going to waste, but a vulnerability she could use? She'd told herself it was a mutual exchange, an honest offer, work for shelter. She told herself it was straightforward. She turned it over in the cold air and examined it honestly, the way she tried to examine most things. And she thought, no, not in the way they meant. She hadn't calculated warmth or widower's loneliness or any of that. She'd calculated peaches. She'd calculated jars. She'd seen work she could do and a man who needed it done, and she'd made an offer. But she'd also stayed. And the staying had become something that looked from the outside like exactly what those women thought it was. And she couldn't entirely argue with the outside view, because she didn't fully know her own mind about what she was doing here anymore. Clyde climbed up into the wagon seat, settled his weight, gathered the reins, and looked at her sideways. You look like you bit into something sour. I'm fine, she said. Uh-huh. He clicked his tongue at the horses. Anything I should know about? No? He drove for a while. Burke's wife was in the hotel this morning, he said, as if mentioning the weather. Saw her going in when I was coming out of the feed store. Elena looked at him. He was watching the road with elaborate innocence. Is that so? She said. Just thought you'd want to know. He shifted the reins to one hand, for no particular reason. She looked back at the road ahead of them, the pale winter light on the frozen ruts, the valley opening up on either side with its bare tree hills and its smoke column farmhouses, and she thought about what she was going to do with what she'd heard. The answer, she decided, was nothing. Not yet. Not because she was going to ignore it, but because doing something about it required more than anger, and she wasn't sure she was past anger yet. She was going to need to think. She didn't tell Gideon. Not about the hotel lobby, not about Burke's wife, not about any of it. She told herself it was because she didn't want to put something in front of him that he'd feel obligated to respond to, that she was protecting his capacity to make decisions based on facts rather than on whatever he might feel about someone speaking about her that way. That was partly true. The other part was that she wasn't sure she could tell him without it becoming something more complicated than either of them was ready for. She cooked instead. She cooked with the methodical intensity she'd been relying on her whole life to work through things that didn't have clean solutions. A venison stew with dried herbs from the kitchen garden, a cornbread that she got exactly right on the second attempt when the first came out too dense, a batch of ginger biscuits that she made because she'd found a piece of candied ginger in the back of the spice shelf and her body had wanted them in a way she'd learned not to ignore. The biscuits came out well enough that when Thomas reached for a third one at supper, she didn't say anything, and even Reed took one when he thought no one was watching. What she couldn't stop thinking about was money. Not hers. She had almost none, and that was not a new condition. What she was thinking about was Gideon's, specifically the picture of it that had been assembling itself in her head over 6 weeks of watching the ranch's finances with the peripheral attention she brought to anything in her environment. The preserve income was real, but it was small. The cattle operation was reduced to a skeleton of what it had been. She'd gathered from the hands that Gideon had sold down the herd significantly after his wife died, partly grief and partly practicality, and hadn't rebuilt it. There were buyers for the spring calf crop, but the spring calf crop was limited. And then there was the debt. She'd only heard it mentioned once, obliquely, by Clyde, who had said something about how the banknote on the eastern acreage had been a problem since the year of the bad summer, and then changed the subject when he realized he'd said more than he'd intended. But once was enough. She understood now why Burke's pressure worked, why losing a feed store order actually mattered, why Gideon had been so still and controlled when he'd talked about Burke's land offer. He wasn't just being proud. He was calculating how much room he had to maneuver, and the room was not generous. She needed to understand the actual numbers. She sat with that knowledge for 3 days before she said anything, making sure she was approaching it from a useful direction rather than an intrusive one. Then, on a Saturday morning when Gideon was doing accounts at the desk in the front room and she had a legitimate reason to walk in and out, she was taking inventory of the cold cellar and needed to cross-reference the preserved goods list. She stopped in the doorway and said, without making a production of it, "Can I look at those with you?" He looked up. "The accounts? You're trying to figure out how the winter works, and so am I. I've been keeping track of the preserve income separately. If we put it together with what you're looking at, we'll have a better picture." He studied her for a moment. Then he moved the papers slightly to one side, making room, and she pulled the second chair up to the desk and sat down with her notebook, and they went through the numbers together. It took 2 hours. She didn't comment on everything she saw. Some of it was not her business in any ongoing sense, and she was careful about that. But she tracked the structure of it, the way the debt was shaped, and what it was attached to and when it came due. She made notes. She asked 2 questions that he answered with the directness he brought to practical matters, without defensiveness. When they were finished, she sat back and looked at what they'd built on the paper in front of her. "The spring harvest matters a lot," she said. "Yes. If the eastern orchard comes back the way it looks like it might, the treated trees, the ones Reed and I worked on, combined with the remaining sound trees, you're looking at a significant yield. If it's properly processed and you have buyers lined up before the season, you won't have to take what the market gives you. Buyers take time to establish." "They do," she said. "But you have something to offer them now. The hotel restaurant, Alderman's Mrs. Cathcart. Those are 3 buyers who have already seen the quality of the product. Those are references. That's a starting position." She tapped her pencil against the notebook. "I'd like to write letters, on your behalf, to buyers in Billings and in Harlow Crossing. I know the produce market terminology. I know what they want to hear. It won't cost anything but paper and stamps." He was quiet for a moment. "You know buyers in Billings. I know the kind of language that works on buyers in Billings. It's not the same thing, but it's enough." He looked at the papers on the desk, at the numbers they'd put together. She could see him working through it, costing it out in his own head. Not just the financial math, but the other kind, the one about what it meant to let someone this far into the workings of a place. "Write the letters," he said. She wrote them that afternoon, 4 of them, 1 to each of 2 produce distributors in Billings, and 1 each to buyers she'd identified through Clyde's supply contacts in Harlow Crossing. She wrote them at the kitchen table in her clearest hand, making the case for the Hale Ranch peach preserves with the specific, practical language of someone who understood both the product and the commercial context. She didn't promise more than she could deliver. She described the operation accurately and the product quality directly, without inflation, and she let the facts carry the weight. She handed them to Gideon before supper, and he read them standing at the kitchen window with the last of the afternoon light. And when he finished, he set them on the counter and said, "These are good," with the flatness that meant he meant it. "They might not get a response," she said. "They might not," he agreed. She went back to the stove. He folded the letters carefully into their envelopes and set them by the door to go out in the morning. 3 days before Christmas, the first letter came back. It was from a produce distributor in Billings named Caldwell and Sons, and it was businesslike and brief. They were interested in discussing a consignment arrangement for the spring peach season. And could Mr. Hale or his representative correspond with their buying office in January with specifics on projected yield and pricing? Elena read it twice. Then she set it on the table in front of Gideon at breakfast without saying anything. He read it. He set it back down. January, he said. That's plenty of time to put together a proper proposal, she said. I can draft it when the time comes if you want. He picked up his coffee and said nothing for a moment. Then, the second letter, the one to Harlow Crossing. Probably another 2 weeks, she said. Mail's slow in December. He nodded. He was looking at the letter on the table, and she thought for a moment he was going to say something that would cost him something to say, but instead he stood up and picked up his coat from the hook by the door. Reed wanted to look at that drainage section today before the ground gets any harder, he said. I told him I'd go with him. All right, she said. He put his coat on, paused at the door. You have enough of everything you need for... He made a slightly awkward gesture that encompassed, she understood, the pregnancy, the coming weeks, the whole physical reality of what was approaching. I think so, she said. I've been making a list of what I might need when the time comes. He nodded again, sharper, like he was filing that away. Tell me what's on the list, he said, and then went out before she could respond, which she thought meant he intended to actually do something about it, but needed to not be looking at her when he said so. She stood in the kitchen with the letter from Caldwell and Sons on the table and the range ticking as it heated and the barn cats visible through the window approaching the side door in their morning procession, and she let herself feel for just a moment the particular quality of something that might be going well. It didn't feel clean or certain. It felt tentative and complicated and shadowed around the edges by everything she didn't know yet, everything that could still go wrong. But it was there, and she recognized it, and she wasn't going to pretend she didn't. She started breakfast, and when the cats appeared at the door, she gave them the heels of yesterday's bread, and outside she could hear Gideon's voice in the yard saying something to Reed. And the morning was cold and clear, and the jars on the shelf behind her caught the early light through the window in a long, quiet row. The second letter from Harlow Crossing arrived on the 28th of December, 3 days after Christmas, and it was better than the first one. The buyer, a man named Orrin Fessler, who represented a hotel supply cooperative serving 6 properties across the territory, wrote that he'd received Elena's letter with interest and that the timing was favorable. One of his current peach suppliers had reduced their projected yield for the coming season, and he was actively looking to fill the gap. He wanted to know projected quantities, pricing structure, and whether the operation could supply consistently across a full harvest season rather than a single early batch. Elena read it at the kitchen table, then read it again, then calculated in the margin of her notebook what a full-season supply contract with a 6-hotel cooperative would mean against the debt number she'd seen in Gideon's accounts. It would mean enough. Not comfort, not surplus, but enough. The word she'd been measuring everything against since she was old enough to understand that enough was not guaranteed and could not be assumed. She didn't let herself get ahead of it. Letters were letters. Buyers changed their minds, harvests failed, the market moved. She'd seen optimism outpace reality too many times to trust the distance between a promising letter and an actual contract. But she made her calculations carefully, and she left the letter on the desk in the front room with a note that said, "This one matters. I'll explain at supper," and went about her morning. What she didn't account for was that supper would be interrupted. Gideon came in from the yard around midday with his coat still on and stood in the kitchen doorway with an expression she couldn't immediately read. Not the controlled flatness she'd come to know, but something tighter, more deliberate, like a man deciding how much to say. "Burke came to see the bank this morning," he said. She turned from the range. "How do you know?" "Clyde was in town for the Post. Saw Burke's wagon outside Harmon's office for better than an hour." He paused. "Harmon is the man who holds the note on the eastern acreage." She understood immediately. "He's trying to buy the debt." "That would be my guess." She set down the spoon she'd been holding. "Can he do that?" "Harmon's a businessman. If Burke offers him full value on the note, there's no legal reason he can't sell it." Gideon's jaw was tight. "If Burke holds the note, he controls the terms of payment. He can call it due. He can set conditions." "When is the note due?" "March 15th. She did the math fast in her head, the way she'd been doing math her whole life. Kitchen math, survival math, the constant low-level calculation of what was possible against what was needed. March 15th was 11 weeks away. The Caldwell letter, the Fessler letter, the Alderman's account. None of it would produce cash in hand before March 15th. The spring harvest wouldn't even start until May. "How much?" she said. He looked at her. "The note. How much is left on it?" He told her. She kept her face very still. It was more than she'd hoped and less than she'd feared, which was the kind of answer that left you exactly in the middle of a problem. "There's no other way to access that capital before March?" "Not without selling something I can't afford to sell." She turned back to the range and stared at the pot without seeing it. "Write to Harmon," she said. "Tonight. Tell him you're aware of Burke's visit and you want the opportunity to discuss the note before he makes any decisions. Don't accuse him of anything. Just establish that you know and that you're engaged." She picked up the spoon again. "People do less to you when they know you're watching." He was quiet for a moment. "You think that'll hold him?" "I think it'll slow him down. Harmon didn't build a banking business by wanting to be in the middle of a land dispute. If he understands there'll be complications, he'll think twice about selling to Burke just because Burke asked nicely." "And if he sells anyway?" "Then we figure out March 15th, she said. "One thing at a time." She said we without thinking about it, and neither of them remarked on it, and she was aware of that unremarking as a kind of fact in itself. Gideon wrote the letter that evening. She looked it over when he was done, not because he asked her to, but because he'd left it on the table where she could see it, which she understood was an invitation. It was a good letter, clear and direct without being aggressive, and she made one small suggestion about the phrasing in the second paragraph that he agreed to, and the letter went out with Clyde the next morning. Harmon replied 4 days into January. He was not selling the note. He appreciated Mr. Hale's correspondence and wanted to assure him that the bank's relationship with the ranch remained as it had been planned. There was a stiffness to the language that suggested Harmon had found Burke's approach presumptuous in some way she couldn't know the details of. But the outcome was what mattered. The note stayed where it was, and March 15th remained a Hale problem rather than a Burke one. Gideon read the letter standing at the kitchen window, then set it on the counter and said nothing for a moment. "It worked," he said finally. "This time," Elena said, "he'll try something else." "I know." He looked at the letter. "But this time it worked." She thought she heard something in his voice that was not quite relief, but was adjacent to it, the particular exhale of a man who had been holding his breath for longer than he'd admitted. January was cold in a way that meant business. The valley road froze solid and stayed that way, and the mornings were so dark and so still that the only sound when Elena rose before dawn was the tick of the cooling range and the distant sound of the horses moving in the barn. She'd taken to starting the fire herself before anyone else was up, which had begun as a practical choice. She woke early anyway, the baby's weight making long sleep difficult, and had become something she didn't fully want to examine, the quiet satisfaction of being the first warmth in the house. Her body had changed in these last weeks in ways that were becoming inconvenient. The size of her made the kitchen work harder. She had to adjust how she stood at the range, had to be more deliberate about what she reached for and how. Her feet swelled by afternoon, and she'd started wearing a pair of her loose wool socks inside her boots, which helped somewhat. She got tired faster than she used to, which she resented more than she probably should have, and she'd made a private rule about resting in the mid-afternoon whether she felt she needed to or not, because she'd learned the hard way that by the time she felt she needed to, she'd already gone too far past it. Nobody mentioned the rule to her, but she'd noticed that the kitchen seemed to empty out around 2 o'clock, as if by accident, leaving her alone at the table with the range for warmth and the stillness of the house around her. She didn't believe it was coincidental. She didn't say anything about it either. She'd started thinking about names, not out loud. In the private space of her own head, turning them over the way you turned over smooth stones, looking at each one from different angles. She hadn't let herself do it before. It had seemed somehow like a thing she wasn't entitled to yet, like buying something before you had the money in hand. But the baby was nearly full term now, close enough that the thinking had started happening whether she invited it or not, and she'd given up trying to stop it. She thought about her grandmother's name and her mother's name, and a name she'd read in a novel years ago that had stayed with her for reasons she couldn't entirely account for. She thought about names that would be easy for a child to carry through a life that was uncertain, names that were solid and plain and didn't require explaining. She thought about all of this privately, in the mornings before anyone else was up, and put it away before the house woke around her. The night Harlan Burke came to the ranch, it was the 9th of January, and he came at supper time, which Elena thought was not an accident. She heard the wagon in the yard and thought nothing of it. Clyde sometimes made late returns from town when the roads were good, until Gideon rose from the table with a different quality to his movement and went to the window, and she read the set of his shoulders before she saw who was outside. "You don't have to stay in the kitchen," he said, not turning around. "I know," she said, and stayed where she was. Gideon went to the door. She heard the exchange from where she sat. Burke's voice first, carrying in the way that men's voices carried when they were used to having rooms go quiet around them, and Gideon's voice responding with a flatness that gave nothing. "Cold night to be making calls," Gideon said. "I was passing through," Burke said, which was implausible given that the Hale Ranch was not on a route to anything relevant, and both men knew it. "Thought I'd stop and have a word." A pause. "You'd better come in then." Burke came in. He was a large man, Elena saw when he stepped through the door. Large and deliberate, wearing good clothes and a good coat. The kind of man who was aware of how he occupied space and used it intentionally. He was perhaps 50, with the particular health of someone who had never worried seriously about money, and he moved through the doorway and into the kitchen with the ease of someone accustomed to walking into rooms that belonged to other people. His eyes found her immediately. He looked at her the way certain men look at a problem they've already decided how to solve, categorizing, assessing, not bothering to conceal the assessment. "Miss Ashcroft," he said, with a courtesy that was its own kind of insult. "Mr. Burke," she said. He looked around the kitchen, at the jars on the shelves, the range, the table set for supper with the men still sitting at it, Clyde with his fork halfway to his mouth, Thomas making himself very still the way young men did when they sensed something was happening they didn't understand yet, Reed with his hands flat on the table and his face carefully neutral. "Quite the operation you've got going," Burke said to Gideon, who had followed him in and was now standing slightly behind him at an angle Elena recognized as deliberate. Gideon was leaving the room open between them, not getting close enough to seem aggressive, not stepping back enough to seem retreating. She thought he'd probably done this before. "We're getting along," Gideon said. "I heard about the Caldwell letter." Burke's tone was conversational, even friendly. "And Fessler up in Harlow Crossing. That's ambitious." Elena kept her face still. She didn't ask how he knew about the letters. The answer was obvious enough. He had people in every business in the valley, and probably one in every post office. "Is there something specific you wanted to discuss?" Gideon said. Burke turned slightly, adjusting the angle so he could speak to the room generally without appearing to address the table. "I've been thinking about what I said in the fall, about the Eastern acreage. I want you to know the offer stands. I'm not a man who rescinds a fair offer because of a delay." He paused. "In fact, I'm prepared to improve it, given the circumstances." "The circumstances being what?" Gideon said. "The note coming due in March." Burke said it with the gentleness of someone setting something heavy down carefully, making sure it was heard. "The reduced herd, the cost of carrying a full household through winter when your operating income has been," he glanced at Elena, "limited." The word limited landed in the room the way he'd intended it to. "My operating income," Gideon said, "is not your concern. I'm making it a friendly observation, not a complaint." Burke spread his hands slightly, the gesture of a reasonable man. "I've got no quarrel with you, Gideon. Never have. I've got land that borders yours and I'd like to consolidate it. That's the beginning and the end of my interest here. The offer I'm making tonight is the best one you'll see before spring." "And after spring?" Burke smiled. It was a measured smile, practiced. "After spring, circumstances may have changed, for better or for worse." He glanced at Elena again, briefly, the way you glance at something you've already categorized. "It's a hard time of year to be taking on new obligations." The table was very quiet. Clyde had put his fork down. Thomas was looking at his plate. Reed was watching Burke with an expression that was entirely flat, and she'd learned to read Reed's flatness as a form of intensity. Elena stood up. She did it slowly and carefully, because at 8.5 months there was no other way to stand up, and she was aware that it took a moment, and that moment was visible to everyone in the room. She straightened her back as fully as she could, which wasn't fully. "Mr. Burke," she said. He looked at her with the patience of someone indulging a minor delay. "You've been to see Harmon at the bank. You've been telling people in town things about me that you don't know to be true. You've pressured Henderson's feed store to drop their order with this ranch." She kept her voice even and factual, not loud, not emotional. "You've done all of this because Gideon won't sell you land he doesn't want to sell, and you think that if you make things uncomfortable enough for long enough, eventually he'll change his mind." Burke said nothing. "What I'd like you to understand," she continued, "is that the spring harvest from this orchard, the orchard you're looking at those jars from, is already spoken for. Not completely, but substantially. The letters you apparently know about are the beginning of it, not the end. By March, when your note strategy was supposed to be working, we'll be in a position to service that debt from operating income." She paused. "That's not a threat. It's information. I thought you should have it." The room was absolutely still. Burke looked at her for a long moment, then he looked at Gideon. Something moved in his expression, not anger exactly, but a recalculation, the face of a man deciding how much to believe. "That's a confident projection," he said. "Yes," she said. "It is." Another pause. Burke picked up his hat from where he'd set it on the counter, turned it once in his hands. "Well," he said, "I appreciate the conversation." He looked at Gideon. "Offer stands. You know where to find me." He went out. Gideon followed him to the door, and they heard the low exchange of male voices in the cold air outside, brief and final, and then the wagon moving out of the yard. The kitchen exhaled. "Well," Clyde said into the silence, "that was something." Thomas let out a breath that was nearly a laugh. Reed picked up his fork and went back to eating with the focused calm of someone who had decided the interruption was over. Elena sat back down. Her back was aching from standing, and she'd done it too fast, and her hands, she noticed, were not entirely steady. She put them flat on the table and pressed until they were. Gideon came back in. He stood at the door for a moment, looking at the room, and his eyes moved to her hands on the table and stayed there for a brief second. "You should have let me handle it," he said. His voice was not angry. It was something else. "You were handling it," she said. "I just added information." He looked at her. "Is it true? What you said about March?" "It's what I believe is true," she said. "I wouldn't have said it otherwise." He held her gaze. Then he pulled out his chair and sat down and picked up his fork. And after a moment, so did everyone else, and the meal resumed with the slightly unsteady quality of a room that has been shaken and is settling back into its shape. She lay awake that night for a long time. Not because of Burke. She'd said what she'd said and she stood by it, and there was no use replaying it. What kept her awake was the other thing, the thing she'd noticed in the moment she stood up at the kitchen table and made herself as tall as she could manage and said words she hadn't entirely planned. She'd meant every word. More than that, she'd said them with a conviction that didn't feel like performance. She'd defended the ranch. Not Gideon specifically, not herself specifically. The ranch, the work, the harvest, the jars on the shelves, the drainage plan, the letters to Billings, all of it. She defended it like it was hers. She lay in the dark and breathed carefully, and the baby turned once, slow and heavy, and she put her hand on her stomach and thought about what it meant to defend something like it was yours before you decided whether it was. She didn't resolve it. She fell asleep sometime past midnight and woke before dawn as she always did. And she started the fire and put the coffee on and stood at the kitchen window in the dark, watching the yard fill slowly with the particular gray of early morning. And she thought that whatever she was doing here, she was doing it with her whole self. And she wasn't sure anymore that she knew how to do it differently. The cold got worse in the third week of January, which nobody who lived in the valley found surprising. What they found surprising was the speed of it. The temperature dropping in 2 days from sharp winter to something more serious, the kind of cold that got into walls and found the gaps you'd thought were sealed, the kind that killed livestock if you weren't paying attention. Gideon and Reed spent 3 straight days reinforcing the barn, rebedding the horses, bringing the 2 remaining cattle into the sheltered pen, and supplementing their feed. Clyde patched the bunkhouse insulation with materials that Elena was fairly certain he'd improvised from some old canvas feed sacks, and his own creative interpretation of what constituted weatherproofing, but which seemed to be holding. Thomas, who was the youngest and therefore drew the short straw on the least pleasant tasks, was in charge of keeping the water troughs from freezing overnight. Elena kept the kitchen hot. It was not a figure of speech. She kept the range running from before dawn to after dark, banking it only overnight, and the kitchen became the warmest room in the house by a significant margin, and therefore the room where everyone who wasn't working found reasons to be. She cooked things that took time and produced heat: long simmered soups, braised meat when the pantry allowed it, bread that needed 2 rounds of rising. The kitchen smelled permanently of something good, and she knew what it was doing for the men who came in from the cold and stood at the range with their hands out and their shoulders dropping from where the cold had pulled them up. She noticed it because she'd been the person coming in from the cold often enough to know what it meant, to have a warm room that expected you. On the 4th day of the hard cold, she woke at 2 in the morning with a pain that was different. She'd been having Braxton Hicks contractions for 3 weeks, irregular, tight, uncomfortable, the body rehearsing for something it hadn't committed to yet. She'd learned to tell the difference between those and real labor from the woman in the last town who'd midwifed her through the early months and explained it with the blunt practicality of someone who had delivered enough babies to be done with euphemism. Real labor built. It had a rhythm. It didn't quit when you moved around or changed position. The pain at 2 in the morning did not quit when she moved around. She sat on the edge of the bed and timed it with the small clock on the dresser and tried to breathe in the way she'd been told to breathe and thought, with the specific calm of someone whose panic is being held at bay by sheer force of concentration. It is 6 weeks early. 6 weeks. She sat there for an hour, timing. The intervals were long and the intensity was real, but not escalating the way she'd been told to expect. She tried to be rational about this. Early labor could slow down. Early labor sometimes stopped entirely. The baby could be fine. Plenty of babies came early and were fine. She also knew that plenty weren't. At 3 in the morning, she went to Gideon's door and knocked. He was awake faster than she'd expected, which suggested he hadn't been deeply asleep. She heard him move before she'd finished knocking, and the door opened and he stood there with his hair disordered and his expression going from sleep-blurred to focused in about 2 seconds when he looked at her face. "Elena." "I think it started," she said. Her voice was steadier than she felt. "It's early, 6 weeks. I don't know yet how serious it is." He didn't do what she'd feared he might do, which was panic visibly or make it worse with excessive alarm. He looked at her with the focused attention he gave to anything that required a practical response and said, "Is it safe to move you? Into town?" "I don't know. The intervals are still long, but—" She paused. "The weather?" They both looked toward the window at the same moment. Outside in the dark, the wind had picked up since midnight. The cold that had been static and dry for 4 days had shifted into something that moved, that carried. Gideon went to the window and looked out. She came to stand beside him, and they both stood there looking at the dark yard and the sky above it, which was not the clear black of a still cold night, but an overcast, moving dark that had a particular texture she recognized even without experience of this specific valley. "It's going to snow," she said. "Yes," he said. "Hard?" He was quiet for a moment. "Could be." She turned that over in her head. The nearest doctor was in Millhaven, 8 miles of frozen road in good conditions. In a snowstorm at 3 in the morning with a horse that would be cold and unhappy about it, in labor 6 weeks early, she ran through the calculation and didn't like where it ended up. "Clyde's delivered calves," she said. Gideon looked at her. "I know that's not the same thing," she said, "but I need to know what we have." "Clyde's delivered calves," he confirmed. "Thomas helped once. Reed hasn't." "What about you?" A pause. "Once? My wife, He said it quietly, and she didn't look at his face when he said it. It was before the doctor arrived. She nodded. "Let that information sit where it was. I'm going to tell you what I know about what needs to happen," she said, "from what I was told. You tell me if any of it is outside what we can manage here, and we figure out what to do about the rest." He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "I'll wake Clyde," and went to put his boots on. She went back to her room and changed into clean clothes and began moving, deliberately, through the mental list of things she'd been keeping without letting herself look at too directly. What she'd need, what she'd been hoping was preparation for a hospital room in town with a doctor present. What she was now recalculating for a cold ranch house in a snowstorm with a rancher and a hired hand who delivered cattle. She found she was frightened in a way that was very specific and very clear. Not the shapeless fear of a person who doesn't understand what's happening, but the precise fear of someone who understands it exactly. That kind of fear was, in its way, easier to function inside of. It had edges. You knew where it was. The wind was louder by the time she heard Gideon's voice in the kitchen, and Clyde's answering it with the slightly rough quality of a man woken abruptly but trying to be useful anyway, and she pulled herself upright and went out to meet them. Clyde looked at her with eyes still adjusting to the lamp and said, "Right. Tell me what you need." And she thought that she had never been so glad of that man's relentless, uncomplicated willingness to simply help. Outside, the first snow was beginning. She could hear it starting against the windows. Not yet heavy, but committed. The kind of snow that had decided on something and would be a while changing its mind. The next 12 hours were not going to be easy. She knew that. She stood at the kitchen table with Gideon across from her and Clyde beside her, and the lamp burning between them, and the snow tapping at the windows. And she thought about her grandmother's name, and her mother's name, and the names she'd been turning over in the dark, and she made herself breathe. "All right," she said. "Here's what we're going to do." The snow came harder, and the wind rose, and the night settled into the particular seriousness of a thing that had moved past the point of possibility into the territory of now. What she told them was practical, and she told it without flinching, because there wasn't time for anything else. She'd been storing the information in her head since the midwife in the last town had sat across from her at a kitchen table not unlike this one, and talked her through what to expect, what to watch for, what to do if things went sideways before a doctor could arrive. Elena had listened the way she listened to everything important, with her whole attention, filing each detail in the part of her mind where she kept things she might need later. She hadn't wanted to need it. She'd been planning on a doctor, on a proper room, on everything working out in the organized way she'd been telling herself it would. She told Gideon and Clyde what they needed to know, clean linens, as many as they could gather. She'd been keeping a stack in the dresser for exactly this, and she told them where. Boiled water and kept hot. The kitchen was the warmest room, and the kitchen table was the wrong height, but the bed in her room was workable if they moved the small table from the hallway next to it for supplies. Clyde was going to need to wash his hands and keep them clean, which she said directly and without softening, and he nodded without taking offense. "What about the baby being early?" Clyde said. He was trying to keep his voice practical, and mostly succeeding. "What does that change?" "It means the baby will be small," she said. "Smaller lungs, smaller everything. The first thing is keeping it warm. Immediately warm, not warm in a few minutes. Immediately." She looked at Gideon. "That's the part I need you to think about. The range needs to stay at full heat through the night and whatever comes after. The room needs to be as warm as we can get it." Gideon nodded. He was doing what he did when something required him, becoming very still and very focused, all of his attention narrowing to the problem in front of him with the concentration of a man who knew how to manage crisis by not wasting anything on the parts he couldn't control. "There's something else," Elena said. They both looked at her. "The milk." She kept her voice level. "A premature baby may not nurse well right away. We may need another way to feed it." She paused. "Bessie, the milk cow. I need her close. Is there any way—" "I'll bring her into the barn aisle," Gideon said, already thinking through it. "Close to the house." "I was going to say closer than that," Elena said. He looked at her. "I know it's your house," she said. A pause that lasted 2 full seconds. "I'll bring her into the back hall," he said. "Off the kitchen. We can put down straw." Clyde opened his mouth and then shut it again, which was, Elena thought, probably the right call. "All right," she said. "Let's get everything ready before things get serious, because once they get serious, we won't have time." Outside, the snow was no longer tapping. It was pressing. The sound of it had changed from intermittent to continuous, the wind driving it against the north-facing windows in a way that filled the room with white noise. And when Thomas appeared in the kitchen doorway in his coat with snow on his shoulders from having come from the bunkhouse, His face said that the world outside had gotten considerably worse in the last hour. "Road's going to be gone by morning," he said. "The road's already gone," Gideon said, and went to get his coat. The next 8 hours were the longest of Elena's life, and she had some competition for that title. Labor at 8.5 months for a first child was not brief. She'd known that. She hadn't known it the way she knew it by 4 in the morning, when the intervals had shortened and the intensity had moved from discomfort into something she didn't have a clean word for and didn't need one, because the word wasn't the point. The point was getting through each one and to the next one and not losing track of what her body was trying to accomplish. Clyde stayed with her. She hadn't asked him to specifically, but he'd positioned himself in the chair near the door with his coat off and his sleeves rolled and a look on his face that said he had decided this was where he was needed and he wasn't going anywhere. And she was grateful for it in a way she didn't express, because expressing it would have taken energy she didn't have. He talked. Of course he talked. He always talked. But he'd calibrated it to the room, which she hadn't known he could do. He didn't tell jokes. He talked in a low, running commentary about things that didn't require her to respond. The time he'd helped birth a calf in a flood, the mechanics of it, the things that had gone wrong and then right, the particular stubbornness of animals who came early and didn't know it yet. It was, she realized somewhere around 5 in the morning, a kind of gift, something to hold on to that wasn't the pain, a voice that meant someone was there. Gideon came in every 40 minutes or so and stood at the door, and she reported to him each time in the briefest terms possible, still progressing, not there yet, the range is good, yes I know. And he would nod and go back out, and she could hear him in the kitchen, stoking the fire, moving between the kitchen and the back hall, where Bessie was apparently standing in the straw with the patient tolerance of an animal who had been through worse and found it unworthy of complaint. Reed and Thomas, to their credit, stayed in the bunkhouse and didn't hover, which was its own form of consideration. At 6:30 in the morning, in the full dark of a storm that had buried the porch rail and turned the yard into an unbroken white field, Elena's daughter arrived. She was small. She was very small, in the way that catches in your chest before your brain has finished processing what you're seeing, a fact that presented itself as both real and somehow startling, though Elena had known it was coming. She was small and she was crying, which was the right sound. The sound Clyde said, "There she is too," with a voice that was not entirely steady, and Elena held her against her chest with both hands and felt the weight of her, which was not much weight at all, and said nothing because there was nothing to say that was equal to the moment. "She's breathing," Clyde said. He was checking, the way he'd been told to check, her color, her movement. "She's breathing all right." "She needs to be warmer," Elena said. Her own voice sounded strange to her, stripped of everything except the immediate necessity. "The flannel, the small piece I told you about." Clyde had it ready. He'd had it warming by the range, and it was properly warm, not hot, and they wrapped the baby with the efficiency of 2 people who had agreed on the task and were doing it rather than discussing it. Gideon appeared in the doorway. He looked at Elena first, the way she'd noticed he'd started doing, checking her before he checked anything else, as if the order of that mattered. She was exhausted in a way that had passed through bone and gone somewhere deeper, and she probably looked it, but she met his eyes and gave him the small nod that meant she was all right, and then she looked down at the baby and watched his gaze follow hers. He looked at the baby for a long moment. She couldn't read his face. There were too many things in it at once. She saw it, and didn't try to sort them, just let them be what they were. "She's breathing," she told him. "I heard." His voice was rough. "I need the milk. As soon as you can." He went without another word, and she heard him in the back hall, the low sound of him speaking to the cow, and within a few minutes he was back with a small amount of warm milk in a clean cup and a look on his face that meant he was waiting to be told what to do next, which was not an expression she'd seen there before. She showed him how to feed a premature infant with a cloth dipped in warm milk, the way the midwife had described. Patient, careful, a few drops at a time, watching the swallow. His hands were large and he was very deliberate with them, more careful than she expected, with the focus of someone who understood what they were holding. "She's taking it," he said, low. "She is," Elena said. He looked up at her. In the lamplight, in the kitchen that smelled of wood smoke, and the particular close warmth of too many people in a space fighting against a storm, he looked like a man who had arrived somewhere he hadn't planned on and was only just understanding where he was. Elena understood. She was in the same place. The storm broke fully by mid-morning of the following day, a Tuesday, dropping nearly 2 feet of snow on the valley and closing the road to Millhaven until Thursday, when the supply wagon from the Aldermans made its first run through after the storm, and Clyde flagged it down to send word for the doctor. Dr. Ennis arrived Friday morning. He was a spare, efficient man in his 60s who had been doctoring in the valley for 30 years and was not given to unnecessary alarm, which Elena appreciated. He examined the baby. She had named her Clara, which had come to her somewhere in the long, dark hours of the night, with the certainty of something that had always been true. And he examined Elena, and he said what he said with the direct brevity of a man who charged by the visit and didn't pad his assessments. "Baby's small but sound," he said. "Lungs are working. She's taking milk, which is the important thing. You'll need to keep her warm and keep feeding her as often as she'll take it." He looked at Elena. "You did well managing this without me. Whoever helped you did well." "Clyde Merton," Elena said. "He's one of the hands." The doctor glanced into the kitchen, where Clyde was standing with his coffee in both hands and an expression of studied nonchalance that wasn't quite working. "Merton," the doctor said, with a nod that contained a level of professional respect Elena suspected Clyde would be retelling for years. Clyde's ears went visibly pink. When the doctor had gone, and Clyde had gone to the bunkhouse to presumably tell Reed and Thomas every detail of the delivery in the same way he told every story, Elena sat in the chair by the window in her room with Clara against her chest, sleeping, and let herself be still for the first time in 4 days. The snow outside was brilliant, the kind of white that was almost aggressive in its clarity, the storm gone and the sky behind it a hard, clear blue, and the orchard visible from this window. The bare branch rows of it, the pruned shapes of the trees she'd treated in October standing in their even lines with snow along every branch. They looked, she thought, like something out of a drawing, clean and spare and somehow more themselves without leaves than they'd been with them. She heard Gideon in the kitchen. She heard the range, the sound of him filling the wood box, the regular sounds of the house that she'd memorized without trying to. He knocked at her open door. "Come in," she said. He came in and stood near the door in the way he stood when he wasn't sure how long he was staying, and he looked at Clara for a moment before he looked at Elena. "She ate again this morning?" he said. "3 times since 4 o'clock. Elena looked down at the baby. "She's got opinions about being hungry. That's a good sign," the doctor said. "It is," he agreed. A pause. Outside, one of the barn cats had gotten onto the porch rail and was picking its way along it with the focused deliberation of something that had made a questionable decision and was committed to it now. "I had Bessie moved back to the barn this morning," Gideon said. "That's all right. I was going to suggest it." Elena glanced up. "Thank you for that. Bringing her in, I mean. It helped." He nodded. He was looking at Clara with an expression she was starting to understand. Not the complicated look from the night of the birth, but something quieter, more settled. The look of something decided. "She needs a proper cradle," he said. "There's one in the storage room off the barn. I'll clean it up." Elena went still for a moment. She knew where that cradle had come from, or could guess. She knew what had been in this house before she arrived, what the storage room off the barn probably held. "Gideon," she said quietly. He looked at her. "Are you sure?" He held her gaze. "I'll clean it up this afternoon," he said, and went out before she could say anything else, and she looked down at Clara sleeping on her chest and felt something in her chest shift in a way that she was going to need a while to understand. February came in sideways and cold, but without the ferocity of January, and the ranch found a new rhythm around the fact of Clara. It was not a smooth adjustment. Nothing was smooth. Clara woke at unpredictable intervals with a volume that was remarkable for her size, and Elena was running on less sleep than was probably advisable, and the kitchen became organized around the necessity of always having warm milk available, which Clyde took as a personal responsibility in a way nobody had asked him to, but which Elena stopped arguing with because he was reliable about it, and reliability was what mattered. What she hadn't anticipated was the men. Not in any complicated way, in a very simple one. They were careful around Clara with the particular carefulness of people who understand something is fragile and don't want to be the one who breaks it. Thomas, the youngest, had a younger sister somewhere, and it showed. He was comfortable around infants in the hands and pockets, what do you need way of someone who had been useful before and wanted to be useful now. Reed, who showed nothing, had appeared one morning at the kitchen door with a small carved piece of wood that was recognizably a horse, or would be when it was finished, and set it on the table without explanation and left. She'd looked at it for a while. Then she'd set it on the dresser in her room. Gideon had cleaned the cradle and brought it to her room and said nothing about where it had come from or what it had last held, and she didn't ask, and Clara slept in it from the first night with the boneless trust of someone who doesn't know yet that the world is not always safe. The letters continued. Fessler wrote back in late January confirming interest in a supply arrangement for the spring season, pending a pricing agreement. Elena drafted the response with Gideon at the kitchen table in the evenings after Clara had gone down for her longest stretch of sleep, working through the numbers with the same care she'd been applying to everything here since October. Clyde provided coffee and occasional opinions that were sometimes useful and more often enthusiastic. Reed, who had started appearing at the table during these evening sessions without explanation, provided the occasional precise correction when Elena or Gideon misremembered a specific yield figure from the previous season. He had the particular memory of someone who kept track of things because no one else was going to. She'd stopped wondering when Reed had become an ally. He'd become one gradually, the way most things that mattered happened gradually, and she'd only noticed it was complete when she realized she'd started counting on it. The pricing agreement with Fessler was reached in the second week of February. The arrangement with Caldwell and Sons was confirmed 3 days later. Between the two, and the existing relationship with Aldermans and Mrs. Cathcart, the spring harvest was committed before it existed, which was exactly the position Elena had told Burke they were in back in January, and which was now true. She felt the specific satisfaction of that, not gloating, she wasn't built for gloating, but the clean particular satisfaction of a thing she'd said being made real by the work. Gideon sent a payment to Harmon at the bank in the third week of February, a partial payment against the March note, arranged through the advance from the Fessler contract, which had included a small signing payment. It wasn't the full amount, but it was enough to demonstrate intent, enough to make March 15th a negotiation rather than a deadline. Harmon replied promptly and professionally, confirming receipt and indicating the bank's continued confidence in the account. Burke's name had not come up since January. Wolt. March moved the valley toward spring with the grudging quality of a season that wasn't quite ready to leave. The snow receded from the south-facing slopes first, then from the flat ground around the barn, and by the second week Elena could see the orchard floor again, the dark wet earth between the tree rows, the first suggestion of green at the base of the grass, the particular look of ground that has been covered all winter and is reassembling itself. She went out to the orchard on the first warm afternoon, Clara strapped against her chest in a sling she'd sewn from a piece of flannel, and walked the rows. The beetle-treated trees had made it. Not all of them. She'd been honest with Gideon about the 3 she thought were too far gone, and she'd been right about those. They'd need to come out. But the others, the 9 she and Reed had worked through in October with the stiff brushes and the lime mixture on their knees in the cold, were showing bud set. Small, tight, the buds barely differentiated yet from the branch. But there, alive, promising something. She stood in the row and looked at them for a long time, Clara warm against her chest, the valley spread out below and the mountains to the north still white. She heard footsteps on the orchard path and turned. Gideon coming from the direction of the barn with his jacket open, the kind of open-jacketed walk that was a man's acknowledgement that it was warmer than yesterday. "She awake?" he said, nodding toward Clara. "Just went down." Elena kept her voice low the way you learned to. "I wanted to see the trees." He came to stand beside her and looked at the budding branches the way he looked at everything on this property, with an attention that was specific rather than general, actually seeing what was there rather than the category of thing it represented. "The 9 we treated," she said. "They're budding." "I saw the 3 down ones this morning." He meant the dead ones, she knew. He'd gone out early, which was not unusual. Need to come out before they block light to the row. I know. Reed said he could do it next week. Gideon looked at the living trees. My grandfather planted the first block of this orchard, he said, before I was born. The eastern rows are mine. I planted them the year we got the property. He paused. First harvest was 3 years after. My wife, he stopped there. The sentence left incomplete, and she didn't fill the silence. After a moment, he said, she made preserves the first year. Didn't know quite what she was doing. The jars didn't seal properly. Lost half of them. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking at the trees. She was annoyed about it for the better part of a month. Elena thought about the woman who had stood in this orchard before her, annoyed at her jars, learning the same things Elena had learned in different kitchens in different places. I would have been too, she said. He almost smiled. She'd learned to see it in him. Not the full expression, which he didn't give easily, but the precursor to it, the small movement at the corner of his mouth that meant something had reached him. The note, he said. I settled it this morning. She looked at him sharply. The full amount? The full amount. The Fessler advance covered the balance. He said it without particular triumph, the way he said things that were facts. We're clear, she breathed. She felt the weight of what that sentence meant. For the ranch, for him, for the eastern acreage that Burke had been trying to get his hands on for 3 years. And she let herself feel it for a moment before she put it away. That's good, she said. The words were inadequate, and she knew it, and she said them anyway. It is, he said. They stood in the orchard for a while longer. Clara made a small sound against Elena's chest and settled again. Somewhere in the tree above them, a bird had arrived with the spring and was announcing itself. Harlan Burke arrived on the last Saturday of March, on a morning so clear it seemed almost deliberate, like the day was showing off. Elena saw his wagon from the kitchen window while she was feeding Clara, and her first instinct was the old one, the tightening in her chest, the inventory of what was exposed, what needed protecting. She sat with that instinct for a moment and then set it aside, because her hands were full and the ranch was in order and the note was paid, and what Burke was arriving to find was not what he'd been expecting since October. Gideon went out to meet him in the yard. She could see them from the window. Gideon standing with the relaxed attention of a man on his own ground, Burke down from his wagon, the conversation happening in the bright, cold morning air. She couldn't hear it. She watched the shape of it instead. Burke doing more of the talking, which was his custom, and Gideon listening with the stillness that she'd learned was not passivity, but something more like patience. The patience of someone who doesn't need to fill space. Clyde appeared at the kitchen door with his coffee and positioned himself where he could also see out the window. How's it looking? He said, keeping his voice low even though they were inside. Calm, Elena said. That's either good or very bad with Burke. It's good, she said. She didn't know precisely how she knew, but she did. The quality of Gideon's posture, the way Burke's gestures had narrowed from expansive to something more contained. She watched Burke take a piece of paper from his coat pocket and offer it to Gideon, who took it and read it and handed it back. More conversation. Then Burke looked toward the house, and even at the distance she was aware of the look. Taking in the smoke from the chimney, the kitchen garden where she'd started the first early plantings, the bunkhouse with its patched insulation, the barn with its new lumber on the far side where Reed had reinforced the walls in February. Whatever Burke saw, he was quiet for a moment after seeing it. Then he and Gideon shook hands. Not the handshake of an agreement, but the handshake of a conclusion, the formality of two men ending something. And Burke climbed back into his wagon, and Gideon stood and watched him go until the wagon had cleared the gate and turned toward the valley road. He came inside. Clyde was still in the doorway. He looked at Gideon with his eyebrows raised. He had a new offer, Gideon said. And? Clyde said. I said no. He took his coat off and hung it on the hook. He said he understood. Clyde looked as if he'd been handed a gift he hadn't expected. Just like that? More or less. Gideon looked at Elena. Clara was awake now, looking up at the kitchen ceiling with the concentrated expression she got when she was tracking the way the light moved. He's not coming back. You think so, Elena said. The note's cleared. The contracts are in place. He's got nothing to leverage. He poured himself a coffee, standing at the range. Burke's a businessman. He'll find something else to want. She believed him. Not because it was guaranteed, nothing was guaranteed, but because she could see the shape of it from here, and the shape made sense. Burke had spent months applying pressure to a structure he believed was weakening. What he'd found instead, arriving on a clear morning at the end of March, was a structure that had spent the winter quietly getting stronger, and that had the particular solidity of something reinforced from the inside rather than patched on the outside. He'd found a working ranch. He'd found a kitchen that smelled of bread and preserves and coffee, and a bunkhouse with men who'd decided they were staying, and an orchard with buds on its treated branches and a note that was paid. He'd found no gap to put pressure into, and a man who wasn't going to offer him one. Clyde exhaled in the way of someone releasing something they'd been carrying for a while. "I'll tell the boys," he said, and went out with his coffee. Elena looked at Gideon across the kitchen. He was watching her with the watchful attention that had been his first expression when she'd appeared at his door in the rain in October. But it was different now. She could see what was in it, which was something she hadn't been able to see then. Not suspicion, not calculation. Something else. She looked down at Clara, who had found her own hand and was examining it with the philosophical focus of someone encountering a new problem. Elena put her little finger against Clara's palm and felt the automatic grip close around it, small and certain. "The first blossom count," she said. "Reed thought next week if the weather holds." "The weather'll hold," Gideon said. "You don't know that." "No," he said, "but it'll hold." Outside the kitchen window, the orchard stood in its rows in the clear March light, the buds tighter on the branches than they'd been yesterday. The valley opening out beyond it toward mountains that were still white on their peaks and green at their feet. And the day was ordinary and real and full of work that still needed doing, which was exactly what it was supposed to be. The blossoms came in the first week of April, and they came all at once. That was the thing about fruit trees. They didn't ease into it. One morning the branches were bare, and the next they were covered, as if the trees had been holding their breath all winter and finally decided to let go. Elena stood at the kitchen window with her coffee and looked at the orchard and felt something she couldn't immediately name, something that sat between recognition and relief. The particular feeling of watching a thing you worked for become real in front of you. Reed had done his blossom count on the last Tuesday of March, walking the rows with a methodical patience that took him the better part of a morning, and his report had been delivered at supper with the minimal ceremony that characterized everything Reed did. The treated eastern trees were showing stronger bud set than the untreated sections, which was not what he'd expected, and the 2 rows along the south fence that had always been the most productive were looking, in his assessment, like the best season in 4 years. He'd set it into his plate, not making a production of it, and then continued eating, and Clyde had made enough production of it for everyone at the table combined. That had been 2 weeks ago. Now the trees were white with it, the whole hillside visible from the house transformed overnight into something that stopped you mid-task and made you look. Even Gideon had stood on the porch for a few minutes that morning before going to the barn, which was not something he did. He went from the house to the work with the direct efficiency of a man who didn't usually stop to look at things. She'd watched him from the window. She'd been doing that since October without meaning to, reading him the way you learn to read the specific grammar of a person who doesn't use many words. What the set of his shoulders meant, what it meant when he stood at a particular window, the difference between his silence when he was working through something difficult and his silence when he was simply at ease. She'd accumulated this knowledge without deciding to, the way you accumulate knowledge about any place you live in long enough, and she'd been trying not to examine what it meant that she had it. Clara was 4 months old and had strong opinions about mornings. She'd woken at 5 expressing these opinions, and Elena had fed her and changed her and walked her around the kitchen until she'd settled, which had taken 40 minutes and involved a level of negotiation that Elena found both exhausting and, in its own strange way, satisfying. Clara was small still, small for her age, small for her corrected age, small in absolute terms, but she was catching up in the gradual, determined way that Elena was starting to recognize as characteristic. Not fast, not dramatically, just consistently, every week a little more than the week before. Her grip stronger and her focus sharper, and her volume somehow entirely disproportionate to her size. She had a look sometimes, especially in the morning light, that Elena couldn't account for. A particular quality of attention, watchful and taking things in, that made her look older than she was. It was probably just an infant's face, Elena told herself. Probably all infants looked like that sometimes, and their mothers read things into it that weren't there. She read things into it anyway. Gideon had taken to stopping by the kitchen in the evening, after supper, and after the hands had gone back to the bunkhouse, on the pretext of checking the wood box or refilling the coffee pot. He always had a reason. The reasons were always slightly transparent. Elena had never made him explain them. What he actually did during these evenings was sit at the table with his coffee and look at Clara, who at this point could track movement and had started responding to familiar voices with an expression that was not quite a smile, but was approaching the territory, and he and Elena would talk. Actually talk. Not the practical exchange of necessary information that had characterized their early weeks, but conversation. The kind that meandered and doubled back on itself, and sometimes went somewhere neither of them had planned. She'd learned that he'd come to the valley at 19 with his father, who had died 2 years into building the ranch and left him the property and a debt that had taken 7 years to clear. She'd learned that he'd been a different kind of man before his wife died. Not dramatically different, he said, with the honesty of someone who didn't idealize their own past, but more inclined toward company, toward going into town, toward the social texture of life in a place rather than just the work of it. Grief had made him small, he said, and he'd let it because it was easier than fighting it. And by the time he'd noticed how small he'd gotten, he was used to it. He'd said that last part to the table, not to her, in the way people say things they've been thinking for a while but haven't said out loud before. She'd told him some things in return. Not everything. Not the full accounting of Portland, not the specifics of the man who'd been Claire's father, and who had made his position on the matter clear enough that she'd stopped waiting for it to change. She told him the shape of it, the outline, without the details that were still hers to keep. He didn't press. He accepted the outline the way she'd accepted his, and they built their understanding of each other on what was offered rather than on what they could extract, which was, she thought, probably the only honest way to build it. She didn't know what they were building. She'd been in the house 6 months and she didn't know, and she'd gotten to a point where she was less afraid of not knowing than she'd been in January, which was itself a kind of progress. The travel bag was still at the foot of the bed. The first delivery to Fessler's cooperative went out in the second week of May. Not peaches, the peach season was still 8 weeks out, but the early preserve inventory, the last of the winter stock, sold at the pricing they'd agreed in February. Clyde drove the wagon himself and came back with a money order and the news that the hotel buyer in Harlow Crossing had shaken his hand and asked about expanding the arrangement to include pears and plums if the operation could supply them. Elena was in the kitchen making a list of everything that needed doing before the main harvest when Clyde came in and laid the money order on the table in front of her with the ceremonial satisfaction of someone delivering something they'd had a hand in earning. She looked at it. She did the math, which she'd done in advance but which was different when the number was real and on paper in front of her. "He wants pears," Clyde said. "I heard. And plums." "I heard that too." She picked up the money order and set it on the desk in the front room for Gideon, where he'd find it. "We don't have pears or plums. We have the North Field," Clyde said. "Reed's been saying for 2 years that the soil up there would hold stone fruit. Reed says a lot of things when he thinks nobody's listening." "He says useful things," Clyde said, which was as close to a defense of Reed as she'd ever heard Clyde offer, and which told her something about how the months had changed the dynamic between the two of them. She thought about the North Field. She'd been thinking about it, actually, in the peripheral way she thought about a lot of things here. Not directly, not planning it out, just letting it sit in the back of her mind where she kept the things she wasn't ready to decide yet. The North Field was good ground. She'd seen it in the fall before the snow, and she'd seen it again in March when the snow pulled back, and Reed was right that the soil would hold stone fruit. Planting stone fruit was a 3-year investment before you saw a harvest. She stood in the kitchen with that fact in her mind and felt the full weight of what it meant to think about it at all. Gideon found the money order that evening and came to find her in the kitchen, where she was feeding Clara in the chair by the window with the late light coming in at a low angle that turned everything amber and soft. He leaned against the doorframe with the money order in his hand and looked at it, and then at her. "Clyde said Fessler wants to expand the arrangement," he said. "He mentioned pears and plums." She shifted Clara slightly. "We'd need to plant." "I know." He looked at the money order again. Something about his expression reminded her of the way he'd looked at the orchard the morning the blossoms came in. Not surprised by it exactly, but registering something that had been happening gradually and was now visible all at once. I haven't planted anything new in 4 years. She didn't say anything to that. Elena, he looked up from the money order. I know, she said. You know what I'm going to say? You're going to say that the North Field is good ground, and planting it makes sense, and you'd like my opinion on the timing and the varieties. She looked down at Clara. And I'm going to say that planting stone fruit is a 3-year return on investment, and that we'd need to source the stock in the next few weeks if we want to get them in the ground before June. He was quiet for a moment. That's not actually what I was going to say. She looked up. He set the money order on the counter and crossed his arms in the way he did when he was trying to organize words that weren't coming easily. She'd learned this about him. He wasn't inarticulate, but he was slow and deliberate with anything that mattered. And the slowness was not evasion, but the opposite of it, the carefulness of someone who meant what he said and needed to be sure he was saying the right thing. I need to know if you're staying, he said, flat, direct, the way he stated facts. I'm not asking because it affects the planting decision. I'm asking because I'd like to know. The kitchen was very quiet. Clara had fallen asleep, as she sometimes did mid-feeding, with the absolute confidence of someone who trusted the arms holding her. I've been trying to figure that out, Elena said. I know you have. How do you know? He looked at her in the specific way he had of looking, steady, not demanding anything, just present. The bag, he said. You haven't unpacked it. She felt something move in her chest. She thought no one had noticed. She'd been careful about it, not deliberate. She hadn't kept the bag packed as a statement. She'd kept it packed because unpacking it felt like a claim she wasn't sure she was entitled to make. The bag is a habit, she said. I know what kind of habit it is, he said. I had one too, after Margaret. He paused. After the boy. I kept the ranch running, but I didn't plant anything new. I didn't plant anything past the next season. That's a kind of bag too. She looked at him. He was looking at the counter, not at her, and she could see what it cost him to say it. Not the grief, which had been incorporated into him the way scars get incorporated, but the admission of it, the acknowledgement that he recognized his own pattern from the outside. What changed? She said quietly. He looked up. You came and planted things, he said. And then because he was Gideon and not given to leaving things poetic when they could be plain, and fixed the drainage, and wrote letters to buyers, and told Burke off in my kitchen. He paused. And had a baby in the middle of a snowstorm without asking anyone's permission. She almost laughed. The almost of it felt good, felt right. I didn't plan the snowstorm. Nobody plans the things that matter, he said. That's not how they work. She looked at Clara asleep on her chest, the small weight of her, the way her mouth had gone slack in sleep with the utter unconscious trust of something that didn't know yet how to hold things back. Elena thought about all the things she'd been holding back since October. Not from Gideon specifically, but in general, as a practice, the way she'd held everything back for years as a method of survival. Don't plant things you'll have to leave. Don't learn the floorboards and the sound of the range, and the way the light moves through the kitchen in November. Don't let yourself know the people well enough that leaving them takes something from you. She'd failed at all of it. She'd failed at it so completely and so continuously that the failure had become indistinguishable from something else. I need to tell you something, she said. He waited. I don't know how to stay without being afraid of it, she said. I've been moving since I was 22. Different kitchens, different towns, and I got good at leaving because getting good at leaving is easier than getting good at the other thing. And when I came here, I told myself it was temporary. I told myself it clearly, so I'd believe it. And then I stayed. She stopped. Outside, the last of the evening light was going out of the sky, the orchard fading into shapes in the dusk. And now I can't remember what temporary felt like, she said. This place feels like the thing I've been calculating toward for years, and I didn't plan that. I didn't choose it deliberately. It just happened while I was working. Gideon was quiet for a long time. When he spoke, his voice had the roughness she'd learned to associate with something being said directly from wherever he actually kept things. That's how I'd like you to stay, he said. Not because you decided to, because you can't remember when it stopped being temporary. She held his gaze. Clara breathed steadily against her chest. I need to unpack a bag, she said. I know, he said. I'll get more room in the wardrobe. She did it that night, after Clara was in the cradle and the house had gone quiet. She sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the bag for a moment. The wool blanket she'd bought at a church sale in the last town, now washed and folded on the bed because she'd stopped keeping it in the bag months ago without registering that she had. The tin that had held dried apricots, now holding buttons and small useful things she'd accumulated. The notebook with the recipes in it, which had been living on the kitchen shelf since November because that was where it belonged. She'd already been unpacking it, she realized. Piece by piece, without ceremony, without deciding to, she'd been taking herself out of the bag and putting herself into the house for months. What was left in it was the structure of the thing, the bag itself, and the 2 changes of clothes she kept there, and the underlying arrangement that said she could leave quickly if she needed to. She took the clothes out and put them in the dresser. She folded the bag and put it on the high shelf in the wardrobe behind the spare blankets, where it would be findable if she needed it, and invisible if she didn't. She sat on the edge of the bed for a moment afterward, her hands in her lap, and let the quiet of the house be around her. The sound of the range ticking as it cooled, the distant sound of one of the horses in the barn, Clara's breathing from the cradle, so regular and even that Elena had spent the first 2 months waking at night to check it, and had only recently managed to hear it as the reassurance it was rather than something to monitor. She thought about what her grandmother had told her once, in the kitchen of the house Elena had grown up in, at a table that had gone to auction when Elena was 18, and the whole structure of that life had disassembled. Her grandmother had been making preserves, as she often was, and Elena had asked her something about how you knew when you were where you were supposed to be, which was a question a 16-year-old asks and thinks is profound. Her grandmother hadn't answered it the way Elena expected. She'd said, "You stop checking the door." Elena had thought she understood that at 16. She hadn't. You understand something like that the way you understand all real things. Not all at once, not through explanation, but over time, through the accumulation of days that teach you what it means from the inside. She wasn't checking the door anymore. She hadn't been, she realized, for a while. May turned into June, and the valley moved into the full heat of summer with the particular aliveness of a place that has been cold for a long time and is making the most of the warmth. The orchard was heavy with developing fruit by mid-June. The trees that had stood bare in October now bowed slightly with the weight of what was coming, the peaches still green and hard but sizing up steadily, and Elena walked the rows every morning with Clara on her hip, which was her version of what Gideon did with the fence line. A daily accounting, a way of knowing what was happening out there. She'd started teaching Thomas to do the blossom thinning properly. He was willing and quick, and he had the patience for detail work that the task required, and she'd found that explaining what she knew was its own form of understanding it better, that the teaching clarified the thing being taught in ways she hadn't expected. Reed had started on the North Field in late April. Nobody had made a formal decision about it, or if they had, Elena hadn't been present for it. What happened was that she'd said the thing about the 3-year return on investment and the timing for sourcing stock. And 2 weeks later, Reed had appeared in the kitchen with a hand-drawn soil map of the North Field and asked her what variety of plum she thought would do best in that drainage profile. And she'd said Italian, probably, and he'd nodded and gone back out. And 3 weeks after that, the first stock had arrived on the supply wagon. She'd gone out to look at them when they were planted, the small staked trees in their rows on the North Field, each one barely thigh-high and barely there, more promise than substance. She'd stood and looked at them for a while with the same feeling she'd had looking at the blossoms in April, the particular feeling of a thing that will take time, that asks you to believe in what it's going to be rather than what it is right now. 3 years. She'd committed to 3 years without saying so explicitly, and everyone on the ranch knew it, and nobody had made a speech about it, which was exactly how it should have been. Clara had pulled herself up to standing for the first time on a Tuesday morning in late June, using the leg of the kitchen table, and had stood there for approximately 4 seconds, looking startled before sitting back down. Elena had been at the range and had turned at the sound, the small grunt of effort, the solid thump of sitting back down, and had seen Clara on the floor looking at her own hands with an expression that was purely evaluative, as if she was working out what had just happened and whether to try it again. She'd tried it again 40 minutes later, and this time she'd done it more deliberately, and she'd stood for longer. Thomas had come in from outside between the first and second attempts and witnessed the second one, and his response had been so genuinely delighted that even Clara had seemed taken aback by it, which had made Thomas laugh, which had made Clara stare at him with the absolute focus she brought to anything new, which had made Elena stand at the range with a spoon in her hand and feel something she hadn't let herself feel in a long time. Uncomplicated, ordinary happiness. Not joy of the enormous kind that announces itself. Just the smaller, more durable kind that shows up on a Tuesday morning when a baby stands up for the first time and a young man laughs. She thought about her grandmother making preserves, checking nothing. She thought, yes, that. Gideon had gone to Millhaven in the third week of June on the supply run, which he didn't usually do himself but had offered to do because Clyde had a persistent cough that Elena had told him twice to rest, and which he had not rested until she'd told him a third time, with a specificity about what would happen if it turned into something serious that had finally convinced him to stay in the bunkhouse with tea and his opinions. He came back in the late afternoon with the supplies and a letter from Fessler confirming the summer order, and a second letter he set on the kitchen table in front of Elena without explanation. She looked at it. The return address was a law office in Portland. She picked it up. Gideon went to put the supplies away, giving her the room without making a thing of giving it. The letter was from an attorney representing a man whose name she knew, and the letter said that the man in question had been made aware of the child's existence through correspondence from a mutual acquaintance, and that he wished to state his position formally. He made no claims and would make no claims. He wished her well. The attorney's tone was the careful neutral of someone who had been paid to be precise and nothing else. She read it twice. Then she set it down and sat with it for a moment. She felt, and she examined this honestly, the way she tried to examine everything, less than she'd expected to feel. She'd spent a long time in the fall and winter preparing herself for various versions of this, for what she'd do if he appeared, if he demanded something, if he tried to take something back that had never really been his. The relief of the letter was real, but the weight she'd been carrying around it was lighter than she'd realized, had been lightening gradually through the winter and spring, and now with the letter on the table, the remaining weight just left. That was his then, and it was done, and Clara was hers, and she was here. Gideon came back in and looked at her face when he came through the door, the way he'd started doing, reading it the way she read his. "You all right?" he said. "Yes," she said, and meant it cleanly. He nodded. He poured 2 cups of coffee and set one in front of her and sat down across from her at the kitchen table, and she told him what the letter said in the brief factual terms it deserved, and he listened the same way, and when she was done he said, "Good," and they drank their coffee. There was a thing she understood in that moment, looking across the table at him, that she'd been approaching from different angles for months without quite finding the center of it. It was this. She'd spent years measuring safety by how easily she could leave a place, how light she could travel, how little she could afford to need, how quickly she could be gone if gone became necessary. She'd called that independence. She'd called it self-sufficiency. She'd believed it was the honest version of freedom, the only kind available to someone without a safety net, and she hadn't been entirely wrong, but she'd also confused the strategy with the goal. She'd been so occupied with being free to go that she'd never asked seriously what it would take to actually want to stay. It turned out it wasn't money, though the money helped. It wasn't security, though the cleared note and the contracts gave her more of it than she'd had in years. It wasn't even love, or not primarily. She was still working out the shape of what was between her and Gideon, and had decided that working it out slowly was better than naming it prematurely and having to live inside the wrong name. What it took was being useful in a way that mattered, being known, not flattered, not needed in a desperate way, but known. The way you know a place by walking all of it, including the parts that aren't easy. It took a kitchen that was hers, and an orchard that had her work in it, and hands on a table in January when things were serious, and a man who read her face when he came through the door. It took a bag she wasn't checking anymore. The harvest came in the third week of July, and it was the best in 7 years. Reed said so with the minimalism that characterized everything he said. Best in 7 years, probably 8. And that was enough. Elena didn't need numbers beyond what was in the ledger and what was in the barn waiting to be processed. The crates of peaches coming in daily now, the the whole operation running with a rhythm it had built over the season. Thomas and Reed picking, Gideon moving crates, Clyde managing the wagon runs to Alderman's and to the Harlow Crossing pickup, and Elena in the kitchen from before dawn, with the range running hot and the jars lined up in formations that kept growing and shrinking as they filled and went out the door. Mrs. Cathcart sent a note in the second week of the harvest saying she wanted double the previous order and could they manage it. Elena wrote back that they could manage it and added a note that if the hotel was interested in dried peach for the winter menu, she had a process that produced a superior product and could discuss pricing. Mrs. Cathcart's reply was 3 words: yes, name it. Clara spent the harvest days in a basket in the corner of the kitchen, close enough to the action to be soothed by the sound and warmth of it, and had developed a habit of watching Elena work with an attention that was probably just infant visual tracking, but which Elena persisted in interpreting as interest. She narrated to her sometimes, explaining what she was doing and why, the same way her grandmother had narrated to her, and she thought that whatever Clara retained from it was beside the point. The narrating was for both of them. On the last day of the main harvest, a Friday, still warm, the late afternoon sun laying long across the orchard in the way of August beginning to suggest fall, Elena went out to walk the rows after supper when the kitchen was finally quiet. She went alone. Gideon knew where she was. She'd told him she was going to check the last section, the eastern rows, and he'd nodded without offering to come, understanding that some things needed to be walked by oneself. The trees were largely stripped now, the remaining fruit the late-season stuff that would come in over the next 2 weeks in smaller quantities. What she was looking at was what was left after the harvest. Not depleted, not used up, but spent in the right way. The way that was the whole point. The way that would feed the next season's growth. The 9 treated trees stood in their row. She stopped in front of the one she'd worked on first, the one in the worst condition when she'd found it in October with the beetle damage going deeper than she'd expected. It had flowered with the others in April, set fruit in May, and produced a crop that Reed had said was measurably larger than the 2 adjacent untreated trees, which was not something she'd predicted but which she chose to take as information rather than satisfaction. The bark was different than it had been. The lime treatment had left marks that had faded but not entirely disappeared, and looking at the lower trunk now, she could see the history of the intervention in the way you could see all interventions if you look closely enough. Not erased, but incorporated, part of the tree's ongoing record. She heard footsteps on the path behind her and turned. Gideon, coat on now, against the evening cool, hands in his pockets, walking without the particular purpose weight he carried when he was heading somewhere specific. Walking toward her. He stopped beside her and looked at the tree. "The bark marks," she said.